Good afternoon and welcome to Invest Precision Medicine. I'm Stephanie Baum, Director of Special Projects with MedCity News. Thank you for joining us for our panel discussion this afternoon, excuse me, Biologics and the Supply Chain Ballet. This panel seems really well timed considering the supply chain woes major industries are facing due to the COVID-19 pandemic, and the biopharma industry is affected by it as well, as this conversation will highlight. The pathway for delivering complex therapies to their destinations is peppered with pitfalls, from how to scale manufacturing of complex personalized therapies to maintaining extremely sensitive components in a controlled environment from production facilities to their destination. This panel will highlight how different organizations in the biopharma supply chain are addressing the inherent challenges of producing and delivering cell and gene therapies and biologics. And with that, let's introduce the panel. Moderating this session this afternoon is my colleague, Frank Vinluan, Senior Biopharma Reporter with MedCity News. Prior to joining MedCity News, he was a senior editor with Xconomy, where he wrote and edited stories about a wide range of topics, including cancer immunotherapy, cell and gene therapies, gene editing technologies, and rare disease drugs. Before moving into biotech journalism, Frank held business reporting positions at the Des Moines Register and the Seattle Times. He wrote his first clinical trial story as a staff reporter at the Triangle Business Journal. Welcome to the panel, Frank. Also on the panel, we have Joe DePinto, Chief Commercial Officer with Vineti. As a proven biotech and pharma executive with more than 28 years of experience, including a pioneering role in cell therapy, Joe brings deep commercialization expertise to Vineti's goal of industrializing personalized therapeutics, such as CAR T cell therapies. Joe has an extensive track record in leading one of the fastest growing businesses at Cardinal Health. Most recently, he has directed two key acquisitions for Cardinal Health, overseeing the company's expansion into new therapeutic categories and led critical operational expansions. Prior to Cardinal Health, Joe's roles have included leadership positions at top pharmaceutical companies, including Johnson & Johnson and Lilly, Sunesis Pharmaceuticals, Dendreon, Imclone, and Abraxis. Welcome to the panel, Joe. Also on the panel, we have Jason Foster, CEO of Ori Biotech, a cell and gene therapy manufacturing technology startup with offices in London and New Jersey. The company raised $30 million in the Series A round in August 2020. Jason has held leading roles in consulting, healthcare, and technology companies for nearly 20 years in the US, UK, and Europe. He spent 10 of those years building Indivior PLC, which went public in a 2.5 billion listing on the London Stock Exchange in December 2014. Welcome to the panel, Jason. And also on the panel, we have Claudia Zylberberg, founder and CEO of Akron Biotechnology. With over 30 years of experience in the regenerative medicine industry, Claudia has established herself as a leader in her field. Claudia's passion for pushing the industry forward in the development and commercialization of safe, novel therapies also led her to co-found the Standards Coordinating Body and serve as an active member of numerous industry boards and advisory committees. Claudia also co-founded AssureImmune, an adult stem cell bank, and worked with Nabi Pharmaceuticals, specializing in human plasma-derived products. She holds numerous patents and developed several patent-pending platform technologies in cryopreservation and novel formulations. She authored and co-authored peer-reviewed publications and received grants from the National Institutes of Health and Department of Defense. Welcome to the panel, Claudia. And with that, I'll take it away, Frank.
Thanks, Steph. Hello to all of the panelists. Thanks for joining us. This is a big topic and very topical as cell and gene therapies continue to gain traction. Jill, I'd like to start with you. You've got some great perspective and experience with your roles at Cardinal Health, and now you're working at Vineti. So I'm wondering if you can give us some perspective on how the space has evolved from small molecules to biologics to now to cell and gene therapies. How has the supply chain evolved?
Thanks for having me, Frank. It's nice to see you. So it's exciting times in science. And when you think about the evolution of what we've seen in the specialty space, from small molecules to biologics to precision medicine, cell and gene therapy, theranostics, the output of that has been unbelievably better efficacy and safety profiles for products, bringing significant benefits to patients. But with that, and a better understanding of the tumor microenvironment, et cetera, we're getting more and more complexity. And we're having to deal with more and more complexity all the way through the value chain, from what my peers will talk about in manufacturing, all the way through to delivery to the patient. So with that high science comes complexity to the supply chain that I think manufacturers, healthcare professionals, and patients alike are having to deal with. And the better we are in managing that complexity and making it more smooth and easy for delivery of care, the better off everybody will be.
Claudia, do you have some perspective from the raw material standpoint of how the supply chain has changed?
Yeah, actually, if we look historically, making small molecules or even biologics, monoclonals, and even recombinant proteins, the manufacture was quite simple in a way. The fermentation and eventually chromatography was just the common denominator, and the raw materials were more involved on that. Now in cell and gene therapy, the complexity is in the components. The components that we are using are more sophisticated in a way. Is not only just making one monoclonal, is using, or one recombinant protein, is using the recombinant proteins for the cell expansion and the media complexity. So there are a lot of, and supplements that sometimes are human derived. So the complexity on the ancillary material side, it's extremely high, and it's important to understand the supply chain now. It's more important than ever, not only because of the controls, but also because of the centralization and decentralization discussions that have been having the industry for a while. That creates a lot of ifs, where the supply chain needs to be taking more attention in temperatures and traceability and chain of command on those products. So there is a lot of variables into it. And I know that with the standardization of the industry, things are going to come into place, but it's work in progress as we speak.
Okay. Jason, do you have some thoughts?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think the complexity, certainly in the cell and gene therapy space, as you look at autologous therapies, the first generation, it poses new challenges. Personalized medicines, that you're making one patient, one dose, and you have to start with patient material that you have to gather from that patient, and then work it through the process, and then take it back to that individual patient. These are challenges we haven't really had to face before. I think everyone just assumes that, it'll go the way that biologics went. It was really hard in the beginning, but then we figured it all out, and now it's all sorted. I hope so, but I think we're a ways off. There needs to be a fair amount of innovation, and we need to think also differently, I believe, about data, the flow of data, the use of data. We're operating in an analog world today in cell and gene therapy. A lot of the data that's generated, certainly in the manufacturing process, is analog. It's in paper batch records and lab notebooks. That doesn't help us. That doesn't help us to advance and speed up the process and become more efficient. So I think we need to think differently and not just hope that it kind of works itself out like it did with biologics. So,
well, why isn't this like biologics? Those are cells. They're cells, tissues. Why are cell and gene therapies different?
I'll give you a layman's view, but you should probably ask Claudia. She'll know much better than I. But cells are different than antibodies. They work differently. The idea that you can put cells in a 10,000 liter stir tank bioreactor and sort it out, I'm just not sure. Cells, they're fragile and they behave in unexpected ways. So potentially, if people think, well, allo will solve it, maybe it'll solve it at a lower scale. Potentially, it will solve some of the challenges. But we're still dealing with human cells, and
right.
At the end of the day, it's different than dealing with antibodies or other biologic material.
Yeah, when you start actually with the cell in itself is such a complex has such a complex machinery that you need to put to work for the end goal of a potency of a potential a function. And that is something that you do ex vivo at the moment right now. And eventually with gene therapy, maybe that you need to create the possibility that the cells can perform the same function in vivo as well. So the complexity is understanding from the cell biology, how the cell functions and what are the cell needs in terms of for them to grow, to differentiate, and to expand. So it is a complex system. It's not like before that was more linear. It's just more of a network of different things that happen at the same time.
So has the supply chain, so obviously the manufacturing of these therapies is much different than small molecules and biologics, but so the manufacturing side is changing. Is the supply chain keeping up with these changes?
I would take that part on the regulatory side. Remember that the cell therapy at the end of the day is not a sterilized product. So whatever the patient will receive is what you end up having as a product after the cell culture. And because there is no sterilization of the finished product, like if you do it with any biologics or any other molecule, any ancillary material, any part of the process that can create or bring any adventitious agents or viruses or whatever, you need to be very cognizant of that. And I think that that's what the supply chain becomes important. Every component has to be of the highest quality and be able to perform consistently batch to batch to batch, so the variables are minimized in the manufacturing process. I will let you, Vineti and Jason, speak about that.
Joe, what do you think about that?
Yeah. I think Claudia brings up some really strong points. When I think about biologics and the evolution of biologics, clearly it's more of a linear or traditional supply chain where it's point to point because you're shipping, even though it's temperature controlled, you're shipping these biologics. With cell and gene therapy, the supply chain becomes a bit circuitous because the starting material is with the patient. Then it has to move somewhere else, depending upon the product, whether that's apheresed and then to the manufacturer, then back to the patient. It's not a linear path. And having strong, rigorous controls and traceability and trackability and understanding what happens every step of the way is critically important in that supply chain. And that's how Jason's talking a little bit about. We're still in the early days, but the digitization of this and the view of this being circuitous rather than linear is something that the supply chain is continuing to evolve and will evolve as different innovations come out into the market. And I would argue even before that, when they're in clinical trials, they're starting this process. So I think the supply chain is starting to evolve as the science is evolving.
So is it fair to say the patient is part of the supply chain now? If it's the process is starting and ending with the patient?
The patient is the product and part of the process, it all is circuitous and it goes back to the patient at the end.
Okay.
And I think for that, just if I can add to that, I think for that reason, the kind of linear approach, the centralized model, manufacturing models of big facilities and lots of people, it may not be best suited for these purposes. You might have some, right now we have activities that happen, sort of manufacturing activities that happen on site, at the site where you collect patient material. And then often it goes off site. Maybe it's flown or somewhere to a centralized facility. It's processed often for several weeks. So you have a lot of these components coming together. And as we see, because of the nature of the heterogeneous nature, the variability of the starting material, patient material, we see a lot of variability in the process. So we often are doing the same thing over and over again to variable inputs, and we're not unexpectedly getting variable outputs, which nobody likes. Therapy developers don't like, regulators don't like variable outputs. So maybe we need to think a bit differently about how we are able to do adaptive control in manufacturing process. How do we adapt to the needs of an individual set of cells within the construct that we can to ensure safety and quality? But it's not just business as usual, I don't think.
Okay. So a couple of you have mentioned digitization, and I'd like to ask you about new technologies for the supply chain. Obviously, the supply chain has to be different, has to adapt. So what are some of the technologies that are being used? to make this new supply chain work? Jason, do you have some thoughts?
Sure. Yeah. No, I might throw that one at Joe because that's one of his areas of expertise.
Okay.
I'm happy to take it and I'll throw it back to Joe. But yeah, Ori and Vineti have just signed a partnership agreement specifically for this purpose to say, could we join up the dots between the logistics supply chain, the data coming out of chain of custody, chain of identity, up with manufacturing data in order to give a complete picture to those who need it. Maybe it's therapy developers, maybe it's clinicians, maybe even patients, about the kind of where the process is in its evolution. Maybe we provide more visibility. Ultimately, we can provide better service, better processes, and learn more quickly about what's working, what's not working, what's causing variability. So from my perspective, data and analytics play a key role in trying to optimize the processes that now are highly variable. We've got a lot of people in these manufacturing processes often, so we need standardization, we need robotics, we need to take people out where we can so that we can introduce repeatable processes that are high quality. But we need to be able to see inside the process and inside the supply chain so we know what's happened to those cells on their way to the facility, what's happened to those cells inside the facility, what's happened to those cells on their way back to the patient, so that we can start to link cause and effect. We can find sources of variability. We can find opportunities for optimization and drive, through advanced analytics. We're using machine learning platform, multivariate analysis, predictive models to be able to drive better outcomes, better standardization, to lower costs. I think that's what's going to take to bring down the cost of goods for what are very expensive therapies today. And unfortunately, because they're so expensive, because they're so hard to produce, they're very hard for patients to access. So only very few patients can actually benefit from these therapies today. And so our ambition as a company is to enable widespread patient access for these incredible therapies and make sure as many patients can access them as who need them.
Joe?
Yeah, so at Vineti, we're really excited about digitization of our platform for cell and gene therapy. We have a platform that we've developed that's called personalized therapy management that allows us to have transparency into the supply chain for the manufacturer, the healthcare professional, and even the patient if need be. And what that allows us to do is to have the data that Jason's talking about around chain of identity, chain of custody, and the logistics component of what is really novel technology and very complex. And we're able to track every component along the patient journey and the product journey as we move forward. Now, this is extensive, very complex stuff. So our platform is highly configurable so that we can adjust to whether it's an autologous or an allogeneic or a personalized cancer vaccine. But partnerships like we're doing with Ori really allow us to have a longer view of what the product looks like. And it's not just one company moving forward in cell and gene, it's how do we all work together to allow the supply chain and the value chain, I look at it as a value chain, to be optimized. So we're really excited about the newly signed agreement with Ori. And, I think it's going to help a lot of patients.
Claudia, do you have anything that you wanted to add here?
Yeah, what we are working and at our end is to understand, in order to reduce the cost of goods and bring more traceability on our products, is definitely the packaging and the packaging work to fit most of the platforms that are out there and be able to work with the right amount that you need. Sometimes, because of the complexity and the cost of these individual components to expand cells or to preserve cells or to transport cells or whatever, we need to work on and the quality component, because the truth is, it's not the cost of the product, it's the cost of the quality and compliance that goes around the product to make sure that we can have consistent material batch to batch and be able to be compliant with regulators globally. So that piece of the equation that comes to us, suppliers of ancillary materials, is critical. So we work with our customers on the packaging side, on the right quantities that they need, so they don't use more or less than what they need or more than what they need, and they don't waste material that is precious, and they are able to work with the packaging that actually make it seamless and less human insert touch, so that becomes very automated, the use of these components. And that's what we've been working on. And it's adding more value to the cell therapy, to the manufacturers, and ultimately to the patients.
Okay. Now, the cell and gene therapy field is still very new, and it's evolving. Obviously, the supply chain is evolving. But if each cell and gene therapy is different, we can't really have a different supply chain for each cell and gene therapy. So I'm wondering where the industry is in terms of developing standardization for processes and procedures.
I would take a little bit of that because that was part of the standard coordinating body foundation. That body was founded about 6-7 years ago with the idea to create standards for the industry that the agencies like FDA, EMA or PMDA were not touching because they were very busy on the therapeutic side. So this standard coordinating body, we're working very closely with SDOs, with standard developing organizations like ISO or like NC or like PDA to create standards for the industry. So ancillary materials have been an ISO technical document and going into a standard very much soon. The same with cryopreservation with PDA that is coming out soon. Bioprocessing, and I know that Vineti and others are being involved in other standards related to the industry. It's extremely important because the standardization will reduce the cost, will make sure that we are all speaking the same language, because these actually advanced therapies, not necessarily cell and gene or tissue engineering, whatever you, is advanced therapy bucket. It's global, and it's something that if we can harmonize the language between the different countries and continents, it will help tremendously to reduce the cost and make sure that we all producing the same product across the oceans.
Joe?
Yeah, I think Claudia nicely stated some of the importance of standards, and we too are engaged with the standard coordinating body. And, looking at over the years, the evolution here of advanced therapies, taking what works from the past and continuing to standardize, that's important. But the uniqueness of cell and gene sometimes allows or necessitates us to look at other components of standardization. And one of the areas that Vineti's been very active in is chain of identity and chain of custody, because the patient is the starting point, and making sure that the critical nature of making sure that product gets back to the right patient at the right time with the right temperature controls through what aren't traditional channels. So making sure that there's a clarity around that chain of identity identification and chain of custody identification is something we've been very active with our colleagues and peers in biotech and major multinational manufacturers to assure patient safety. That's something that we see as a real important component as cell and gene therapy continues to evolve, regardless of whether it's an autologous, an allogeneic, or a personalized cancer vaccine.
Okay.
So one quick point, one thing is standards and one thing is reference materials. So it's make sure that we all understand that reference materials are actually needed for the industry as well as the standards, which is has to do more with processes and so forth. So just wanted to mention.
Okay.
Jason,
did you have some thoughts on standardization?
I mean, I think my colleague summed it up nicely. It's just that it's needed. There's too much variation in today's processes and today's approaches. Everyone's reinventing the wheel. And so being able to standardize some of these approaches, in particular, as we were talking about earlier on the data side, will be a huge, because that piece of the industry is even earlier than maybe the rest of it, that kind of biological focus. If we can get ahead of it and help set some standard, we just hired a chief data officer who'll be joining us in the next few weeks to focus specific on this, helping to work with our partners in the industry to set standards, particularly around data flows, and how to do that well so that we can help drive the industry forward more quickly.
So standards is one thing that needs to be worked on. So what are the other bottlenecks for the supply chain?
So
Jason?
just to add on to some of the standard components, put yourself in the view of the healthcare practitioner who has to deliver this care. Right now, early days of cell and gene, maybe commercialized 7 or 8 products globally. As you look at where the clinical research is going out 5 years from now, it could be as many as 30 additional products that have all this complexity with it. If you don't have industrialized standards and how to deliver this, how does a healthcare practitioner keep it all together to deliver the care? So there's not only sort of patient safety components, there's healthcare practitioner implications as well. And as we talk to healthcare practitioners in these centers of excellence who typically deliver this type of care, they want the standard, industrialized standards to occur because they want to make it easy to deliver care. Especially as these patients are often very, very ill patients. It's often cell and gene is positioned later in lines of therapy. So you're talking about patients that we need to make sure get the product at a certain time and with an ease of care. So just wanted to add that as an additional component of one of the challenges in the supply chain.
Okay.
The standards.
Okay. So we have a handful of cell and gene therapies that are approved, and there are many more on the way in clinical trials. What needs to happen to make the supply chain transition from a clinical stage production to commercial stage? How do you get the supply chain ready for commercial scale production?
I can give it a go, Frank.
Go ahead.
From my perspective, a lot of the challenges we've seen is, particularly recently, has been translating academic processes that end up in the clinic to commercial scale. So it's how do we transition those and translate those processes to large scale manufacturing that's high quality, that's repeatable, and that's hopefully eventually low cost and able to drive the possibility of these products being first or second line. So really the ability to, and I think it's incumbent upon innovators, technology providers to say, well, we need better technology that can actually help in the research lab, help in process development at that smaller scale, that's flexible, that can be sort of more science focused. But also at some point that has to translate into a viable, GMP process without huge investments and years lost, and then, potentially falling over at the last hurdle on comparability. We've seen many of the most recent therapies fall over on that last stage. Can we create a comparable process showing comparable results on a commercial scale that we did on clinical? So some of it's a technology burden that we as innovators have to work with researchers, and also I think as an industry we have to realize that good for us, success for us, should be getting therapies to patients. The kind of days of it being a research project, I think, are over. We need to move this into a more professional, more commercially minded field so that we can start to treat more and more patients and move away from these very complicated academic processes that ultimately, unfortunately, end up not being able to scale.
Yeah, Frank, one of the things we did at Vineti is we have a platform that's modular, and we did some research to look at what are the most important modules for the clinical space. And we really focused our efforts on making that a separate carve out of PTM. And we launched this year an offering called PTM Essentials that is just focused on the clinical space for the clinical sites. Has a bit less functionality than you would need for commercial, but it's a digital platform that allows the companies in multi-center clinical trials to use the platform, have the rigor around traceability and trackability and COI, COC, and have the data to be able to supply to the agency for their filing, because it's clinically focused. And then as it evolves, as they move forward through the stages of clinical development, they can grow with us into our full platform. So we see that as an important component because so much of cell and gene therapy is still in those earlier phases of development.
Okay.
On our end, I think that we work to prepare these ancillary materials for commercial, creating the eCTD drug master files that go together with those products. So the agency feels comfortable every time that they open the CMC application from our customers, and becomes clear to them that the products are consistent no matter which customer is using them. So definitely the investment that the company's been having for the last few years is to create, since May 2019, the agency changed the policies on the drug master files, and we actually abide to that and created eCTD files for all our products. And we are in that process to convert we already converted quite a few of them. We are working on that. And that is an investment. Quality is a high investment in a company. And we only do for the products or ancillary materials that we know they're going to be part of a commercial application. Otherwise, it's a very large endeavor to take it just for research purposes only. Once it's done, what we are trying to make sure is that preclinical researchers that envision that their product are going to be part of a clinical program to start adopting GMP from the early stage. Because at the end of the day, for us, scale is what would make sense in every component that we put into the marketplace. So if we have scale of using that component, we invest in the quality associated with that. So when the commercial time comes, and we already have many of our components in commercial products, that gives the opportunity to the agencies globally to see the quality of the components that are making up that product at the end of the day. So that's what Akron is working on.
So how much of this is coming from industry and how much of it is coming from the FDA? I'm wondering what needs to happen to get regulators comfortable with how these products are manufactured and transported.
I have a feeling that the right way to go, at least on the ancillary material side, is to be a step ahead. On the cell therapy manufacturer, or the sponsors, I think that having all ducks in a row and the characterization of the initial product and the cells, which is critical for them, because if they don't have a good characterization of the initial component, they cannot predict outcomes. And that's what we are seeing right now with many of the potency assay situations that are coming up. The more characterization we have upstream on the components and consistency, the predictability of the output is going to be more common, and gives a layer of safety and comfort to the agencies when they see the filings.
And also, I'd say the regulator's been shown kind of unprecedented flexibility, sort of innovation on the regulatory side in trying to adapt to the needs of this emerging field. So, doing things like combining, phase 1 and phase 2, those are things you wouldn't have seen necessarily before. So they've been showing, while of course, protecting safety and quality, showing flexibility. And so it's up to us. I think, again, it comes back to being able to demonstrate more clearly what good looks like, having more data to be able to demonstrate that actually this process is in control, to be able to set release criteria that are, rather than sort of a finger in the air, which sometimes we have to do, we have a quantitative or objective way in which we're setting those criteria to say, it's at this, it needs to be not this, but it could be that, and here's the data to support that. Some of those first generation products, CAR T products, have 10 or 20% failure rates in their GMP process because the spec is set extremely tight. But then they give that product away on compassionate use, which is a great thing to do, and the patient still gets clinical benefit. So what that tells us is probably that spec, could be a bit looser, but the data is not there to support it potentially. So being able to capture some of this data in the process, during process development, during characterization studies, so that we can actually demonstrate more clearly to the regulator exactly what good looks like, what a process and control looks like, I think will help us.
Yeah, our work is primarily with the manufacturers, but as Jason stated, the delivery of these products through the supply chain is often part of the GMP process and would often be submitted as part of the BLA to the US FDA or any of the regulatory authorities. So there is a lot of focus on rigor and data and what gets captured and how it gets captured for filing, especially when we're working with clinical trial companies.
Okay. I'd like to shift a little bit and talk about the supply chain in the past year and how it's been affected by COVID. The pandemic exposed a lot of vulnerabilities, not just in life sciences, but across many industries. So I'm wondering how the supply chain can be made more resilient for cell and gene therapies. What were those weaknesses, and how can they be made more resilient going forward? Joe?
Yeah, I've been in this industry for 28 years, and COVID and the pandemic brought the supply chain front and center, no doubt about it, especially with the vaccines. And, you know, we've seen some disruption overall in the delivery of these cell and gene products, from anything from clinical trials that were delayed because typically they're done at the centers of excellence. And we saw clinical trials not be able to recruit. I will say this. The manufacturers we're dealing with have multiple approaches and primary and secondary approaches to not only how they approach the supply chain due to the pandemic, out of a sense of making sure they're very thorough and understanding how that delivery occurs. And as the vaccines launch globally and there's less pressure on these centers of excellence, that frees up the care of these patients to get delivery of the product at their site. So there's no doubt the COVID-19 experience has definitely brought supply chain front and center around temperature control, logistics, and how products get point A to point B. But the complexity for cell and gene and the delivery of care in the center of excellence has also been impacted.
Claudia, what were you seeing from the raw material side?
It's interesting because if you look at it right now, the impact perhaps was not on the year of COVID-19. We are feeling the repercussion of that year now, unfortunately, because perhaps many were very risk-oriented. They were very much on the safeguard and had their reserves of plastic bags or tubes or gloves even, and we realized that now that all that part was depleted, now we need to replace it, and that is when the situation starts to be a little bit critical. Less flights that can ship things here and there. So definitely this is the worst case scenario. If we learn from here, this is the worst case scenario. Nothing is just in time anymore. And we need to plan with a little bit of a cushion every time now and then. In our case, we were able to be on time, and some delays happen. But you know, I am cautious to say that, you know, I don't know what will happen in the next few months. You know, I started to feel that the ripple is coming along. Are we catching up? But in general, it's something global, because we are not talking about cells and clinical trials. We're talking about basics, plastic bags. You know, it's just, that is the level that we're talking about. Actually, interestingly enough, the other day we were needed to crate a machine to ship to us, and there was no wood to crate the machine that we need to use for, you know what I mean? So it's just as simple as that goes that level of simplicity that we are not taking into consideration right now. But it's a lesson, a lot of lessons to be learned for sure.
So let's talk about some of those. You know, you mentioned just in time not being something that is possible anymore. So this means that companies will have to keep more supplies on hand, and is that going to increase costs? And will that in turn put upward pressure on these cell and gene therapies?
I have a feeling that they need to have a little bit more cushion and dual sourcing, and, you know, You just have to work on your risk assessment and go item by item and see how can you make it not risk-free, but at least lower the risk substantially after seeing what we have seen this past year and the next few months.
Okay. Jason or Joe, do you have some thoughts on those on Claudia's comments?
Yeah, I mean, I think the sort of Joe highlighted the need for business continuity planning, finding out, who are your critical suppliers and having redundancies in the supply chain. We've seen a lot of the technologies down to the bags that Claudia was referencing go out of stock. And if you don't have those things, you can't run your process. You can't run your clinical trial. So almost every single component is critical, and so, yes, I mean, hopefully this is a black swan kind of thin tail event and we don't have to deal with this on a recurring basis, but I think you will see more safety stock on hand, redundancies in supply chain and manufacturing in multiple places. I mean, whether we like it or not, the supply chain is global. A lot of the things that we're sourcing or that anyone's sourcing are coming from Asia. They're coming from other places that, may experience interruptions. And so you just have to think differently about how critical the elements are in the supply chain. And if you can have redundancy built in, again, this has hopefully been an anomaly, but, I think we fool us once, shame on them, fool us twice, shame on us. We need to be ready for the next one.
And are these changes going to put upward pressure on pricing pressure on cell and gene therapies?
No, I think that this is temporary, but eventually, there are things that are going to be impacted for sure, at least at the moment, but we'll see.
I don't think so. I mean, I think it's just the costs are high currently. The processes are relatively inefficient currently. There's not a lot of room to the upside. Hopefully we've got a lot of room to the downside of downward pressure on costs, at least cost of goods, to give pricing flexibility. So I don't think it'll impact prices substantially. I think what it'll do is just help us, think more efficiently about what we can do to try and prevent these kinds of things from happening in the future.
So will one of the long-term impacts of COVID-19 be more production of the components for these cell and gene therapies being made in the US?
I think it is a possible outcome. I do. I mean, I think we're you look at the global shortage for semiconductors potentially, and you look at efforts like national resilience to bring the capability to manufacture back to the US, and so that we have that capability in country. We had the double whammy here in the UK of having Brexit happen right in the middle of it as well, and you had lorries, as they call them here, or tractor trailers stacked up on either side of the tunnel waiting to come across because no one was sure what paperwork had to be filled out for what. I think it's having manufacturing close to home. One of the things as a startup, in order to work with biopharma, we have to have the answers to these questions. We have to have the right redundancies in place, the right partners. So it's something that we're very focused on.
It's interesting to start to think from global to local, moving that shifting that mindset. It's going to be an interesting one, but definitely it's actually been said yesterday in the announcements that US wants to bring drug manufacturing. But with that, you need to train the workforce. There are a lot of other variables that are needed to be considered as we move along.
Joe, do you have some thoughts on the pandemic impacts on the supply chain?
Yeah, I think and I hope that we're through the worst of it. I do think regional redundancies are going to be common. As we look at the sensitivity of some of this product scope and requirements, sometimes it's not efficient to have one manufacturing site worldwide for some of these cell and gene. So I think many manufacturers have examined this and are looking at it regionally to optimize redundancies, primary and secondary opportunities regionally so that they can still meet the demand they have for either the clinical trial or the commercialization of their product.
Okay. I'd like to invite members of the audience to submit questions. We'll continue. But if you have some questions, please feel free to submit them in the chat. So I'd like to ask the panelists, you know, if the patient is part of the supply chain, how much of the supply chain can be moved closer to the patient? Joe, do you have some thoughts, or Jason?
Jason, do you want to go first?
Sure, thank you. Yeah, I mean, there's sort of this, I don't know if it's a battle really between, you know, centralized model versus decentralized model, and you have kind of the history around transplant medicine taking place at centers of excellence or in hospitals, and couldn't we just do that for cell and gene therapy, and hopefully, you know, more technology like Ori's will help enable us to get closer to the patient. Now, whether we'll ever get into the hospital, you know, people talk about bedside, it's probably many, many years away. But the ability to cut down on some of the vein to vein time logistics associated with, you know, freezing cells, flying them halfway across the world, you know, processing them, freezing them, flying them back, we're bound to be able to do better than that. So you might find models that evolve in kind of a regional fashion, where you've got regional centers of excellence serving, you know, sub-regions within maybe the US or within Europe. You know, maybe we'll get to, for some products, we'll get to hospital-based manufacturing, but I think ultimately there's a long way to go there. You know, there's a regulatory construct that doesn't really allow for that today in the US. The MHRA has indicated a willingness in the UK to support multiple manufacturing sites under one quality system, under one regulatory construct, which would potentially enable that kind of sub-regional model to evolve. But I think we all kind of intuitively understand that, you know, being able, if you're starting with a patient's material, being able to process it closer to where they are is kind of inherently beneficial. So we'll see how those models evolve, and we hope to be part of the ecosystem that helps figure that out.
Yeah, Frank, and Jason mentioned this previously about data, and in our platform, as we capture the product from when it started or originated through the patient all the way to in the vein, what we are able to do with the data is to show efficiency or improvement in how manufacturers are able to navigate through that supply chain. And that over time gets more efficient, gets easier for the healthcare practitioner to deliver that care. It becomes a differentiator for the manufacturer to be able to have that efficiency. So it's something that we in our platform continue to track and to monitor, because we want it to be as efficient as possible in what is not such an easy and at times complex supply chain.
Okay. I've got an audience question. Do you see shortage in manufacturing capacity, and how would that pan out for CDMOs? Joe, I think that would be good for you.
So we have a variety of partnerships with manufacturers, and you know, we typically don't get involved in the manufacturing other than the monitoring and making sure that the raw materials get to the CDMO in a fashion where it's appropriate and then can be delivered back through. So we're sort of the rails that cell and gene therapy ride on to the CDMO. So we don't really get involved in the raw materials, other than the fact that we start the raw material process by making sure that the patient is identified, put into our system, and that the raw materials are taken out of the patient to start, but then they have to be manipulated in some fashion depending upon the type of cell and gene therapy at a CDMO or at a manufacturing site.
Okay. Jason or Claudia, do you have anything you want to add?
Yeah, from my perspective, I think, I mean, we currently have a supply and demand imbalance for manufacturing expertise and capacity. So CDMOs, you know, you'd have to book well in advance for a slot if you could get it and pay handsomely for it. I think, you know, every manufacturer almost that we talk to is building out manufacturing capacity, either for vector or cell therapy manufacturing. And we'll see that kind of resolve itself over time. One thing that I'd like to kind of just add into the mix in this question is, you know, how we think about capacity should change and evolve. You know, bigger buildings, more people, you know, bricks and mortar, that facilities that take 3 or 4 years to build and cost hundreds of millions of dollars isn't the best way forward. You know, if we can bring technologies to market that help intensify the footprint, shrink the needs for those facilities, you can get higher throughput per square foot, you know, maybe, you know, much higher, 10 to 50 times what you can get today using new technologies maybe, and also modular approaches, being able to more easily scale and kind of de-risk that buy or build decision that I don't envy, the heads of manufacturing at therapy developers that have to make this decision maybe years before they get an approval. They say, well, let me project 3 or 4 years in the future and try and figure out how much capacity I'm going to need, when I'm going to get an approval, when I'm going to get market access. It's an incredibly difficult thing. So people who do take the plunge and build their own facilities, sometimes they never end up needing that facility and they have to, sell it on for 60 cents on the dollar. That's not an efficient use of capital. So, through partnerships, we're trying to make it a little bit more modular, a little bit more scalable, and a little bit more just in time. So we don't have to make those huge investments if you're on the CDMO side or if you're on the therapy developer side.
Got another audience question. When it comes to data, the more the better. So how can we encourage different stakeholders to start sharing and comparing data, particularly manufacturers and other actors in the supply chain? Can we envisage the commercialization of manufacturing and supply chain data between stakeholders in the future?
These are initiatives that have been coming around. Actually, last year in the National Academy of Science, we've been discussing the idea of data sharing. And it's something that is going around quite a bit, trying to understand what is the right house for that place, that common place that could happen. Still is work in progress, but there is a big awareness in the marketplace that data sharing is critical and is important for the advancement of the industry. So I foresee that this is something that is coming, even if it's blind data or data related to manufacturing or whatever, you will have more capacity, because the truth is sometimes the number of the trials is N1, it's just one patient because it's autologous. So unless we can share more data, it's something difficult to understand the statistical value of that result at the end of the day. And well, I think that partnerships that Jason was mentioning between CDMOs and local hospitals using existing infrastructure and optimize it with more Vineti infrastructure, technological infrastructure will help tremendously to create more efficiencies and more data sharing hubs as we move along.
Joe, thoughts on data sharing?
I agree with Claudia. There are a lot of different working groups looking at data, and the need for partnerships to share that data because of the longitudinal look at data and the importance of having that over time. And let's be frank, after even the initial therapies delivered, there's still a need for long-term follow-up of these patients that needs to occur. So there needs to be industry partnerships that continue to grow and are developed to achieve that. It can't only be in one place. But I know from some of the working groups in cell and gene therapy that I sit on, it's a very important topic and one that continues to be addressed. And we'll get there, but it's not, I don't think tomorrow, but we'll get there because it's needed to optimize outcomes.
Yeah, and for us, it's absolutely critical, because I think we're structuring data from inline sensors, from process data. We're aggregating that across, all of the users of our platform, and then we're applying advanced analytics. So you need those big data sets. We can actually deliver information and insights back to therapy developers much more quickly than they could ever do themselves, because as Claudia said, they're doing 1 batch, 2 batches, maybe they're doing 30 patients during a clinical trial. It's hard to take a look at that data, especially when it exists in an analog format, holistically, and try and divine anything from it, to derive insights from it. And so the ability, we've done over 100 runs in the platform with 3 different partners. We have the capability to aggregate that all, analyze it, and deliver back information to them. I think, historically, biopharma has been very protective of that data, saying, no, it's mine, even though maybe they don't do anything with it, or they're not creating any value from it, but, it's inherently valuable. So we're going to kind of hoard it. I think if we can guarantee confidentiality and being able to bring some of those things together and show value, the key is being able to show value. People aren't going to share if there's no value in sharing. So I think that's critical for us.
Another question from the audience. Have there been any critical lessons learned from some of the producers of FDA-approved therapies as they scale production of these therapies?
I can start. We've been involved with some of the approved products and some of the clinical phase products. And as we've worked with different companies, you do a detailed implementation analysis because not every platform that we develop or workflow is the same. We try to take a view of what is the patient journey, the product journey, and we sort of overlap those with commercially the reimbursement journey to understand what levers to pull, how we help our manufacturer clients make it simple by asking, hey, is this a must-have or a nice-to-have in the platform? Because the more complexity you build into those workflows, even though we're a platform that's configurable, the complexity all adds up. So lesson learned from our perspective is making those tough trade-offs of what's absolutely necessary versus nice is really important. And a really deep understanding of the patient journey and the overlap to the product journey in these type of products is really important.
Jason, Claudia, lessons learned?
Claudia, you want to go first?
Yeah, I think that the characterization of the cells and the potency assays are one of the critical pieces of the equation in many of the cell therapies. And I think that it's an area that still needs to be worked out and it's work in progress. I think that those are basically for me the major ones. The scale up of them, the majority are autologous. So it's just basically understanding if they can scale out to make it financial sense for what they invested and reach more geographies is what is going to be the next challenge. And definitely work with other local regulatory agencies as we speak. And again, it's something that eventually it needs also another side discussion is the IP related as you expand globally to manufacture them in different geographies. So a lot of good things to be worried about. And as we expand and grow the footprint of these cell therapies globally, understand how can we scale out to make, again, financial sense of these therapies and make them suitable for all the sponsors that invested a lot in it.
Yeah, I think one of the key lessons from my perspective is plan for scale from the very beginning. The challenges of trying to get beyond tens of patients, everyone's kind of stumbled so far on. So it's, if you have that seamless scalability, part of what we're trying to do is to provide seamless scalability from preclinical to commercial, then you don't have those big comparability challenges. You can get to scale, but oftentimes academic research isn't focused on scale. They're focused on the biology. They're trying to solve that problem first. And they say, well, we'll worry about, manufacturing later. By the time you're ready to worry about it, it's almost too late, potentially. And so we've had, a number of folks from inside commercial cell and gene therapy companies say, we don't know that we'll ever be able to get our process under control enough and get cost of goods down far enough to recoup a return on investment of what we put into this therapy. So I think you got to think about scale and manufacturing from the very beginning.
Okay. Well, we're coming up on time, so I just want to wrap things up. I want to ask all of the panelists, looking ahead, how do you think the supply chain for cell and gene therapies will look in the future compared to the way it is today? Jason, do you want to start?
Sure. Well, I mean, I hope there'll be a lot more standardization. We'll know we won't be reinventing the wheel. Bob Preddy is one of our advisors. Some of you know, started PCT many years ago and been in the industry for a long time. He calls it grandma's cookie recipe. Everyone comes with their own recipe. Not only do they have their own recipe, they want their own oven. So it's all bespoke. Could we create standards by which we don't have to start over every time at the very beginning? And then the second point that I would hope for is really a digital approach, a digital first approach. Let's get away from lab notebooks and paper batch records. Let's think about the data as something that we can use as a tool to be more efficient in our process development, in our process discovery, that we're sort of actually discovering what works. There's this sort of adage that process development really starts when you get into the clinic and you treat your first patient, because then you actually know how well it works. But I think, the data and the digitization of these processes from the very beginning could be a huge help as we move forward.
Okay. Claudia?
I think that creating a strong compliant supply chain is very critical. And I know that many different components that, as I mentioned at the very beginning, and complex ones are making up these cell therapies. So the more compliant that we can bring and standardization that we can bring, as Jason said, in the ancillary materials side and in the manufacturing arena, the better. The cost will be more controlled and things will be more predictable in many ways. So I think that bringing compliance is going to be one of the critical pieces for many of our the ancillary material industry members as we move along. That's basically what I think that is going to be the big investment in the next few years.
Joe?
My hope for the supply chain in cell and gene therapy in the future is one that's digital, industrialized standard that can be leveraged across different components of complex supply chain, whether it's autologous, allogeneic, or personalized cancer vaccines, and one that can scale well and can meet the needs of these patients who desperately need it.
Okay. Well, thank you. Thanks to the panel, Jason, Joe, and Claudia. Steph, I'll throw it back to you.
Thanks, Frank. What a compelling discussion about the challenges, the practical challenges on the ground of rolling out these cutting edge therapies in terms of the supply chain. Thank you, Frank, for your moderating skills, and thank you to each of the panelists for taking part.